So, you're saying you're trying to be patient. You told yourself that more than once. Things take time. People need space. Situations need room to settle. That's what you kept repeating. And look, that sounds reasonable on the surface. You remember the moments when the thought first appeared that something might not actually change. It was usually small. A conversation that ended the same way it always did. A promise that sounded familiar because you had heard it before. You noticed it, even if you didn't say anything right away. You remember that moment, don't you? Because something inside you paused for a second. The same sentence came back again. Just be patient. That's what you told yourself. You probably said it quietly, almost like a reminder to stay calm. I understand why that made sense at the time. Because patience feels responsible. It feels mature. It makes you feel like you're giving things a fair chance instead of reacting too quickly. And you didn't want to be the person who gives up too easily. So, you waited. You see. But you're telling that while you were waiting, the situation itself didn't really move. The same conversations repeated. The same explanations came back. Sometimes the same promises showed up again, only phrased a little differently. You noticed that. You probably told yourself that change just takes longer than expected. That people grow slowly. That progress sometimes happens quietly in the background. But something else was happening at the same time. Because each time the situation stayed exactly where it was, the question quietly returned. You saw it. The question you kept pushing away. You remember it, don't you? So, if nothing changes, how long are you supposed to keep waiting? And now you're saying the situation never really exploded into something obvious. There wasn't a single dramatic moment where everything clearly fell apart. Instead, the same explanation kept appearing again and again. Just give it time. You heard that more than once. Sometimes they said it directly. Sometimes it showed up in a softer way. A promise that things would get better soon. A reassurance that the situation just needed a little more patience. You remember those conversations, don't you? You would bring something up carefully. Not as an accusation. Just a question. You noticed something hadn't changed. You noticed the same issue was still sitting there, exactly where it had been weeks before. And the answer usually sounded calm. Things take time. Be patient. Why rush it? And that sounded reasonable. I understand why you accepted that answer at first. Because patience feels like the responsible thing to do. It makes you feel like you're giving the situation a fair chance instead of reacting too quickly. So you stepped back. You probably told yourself that pressure would only make things worse. You probably told yourself that real change doesn't happen overnight. That people need time to figure things out. And while you were telling yourself those things, the situation stayed exactly where it was. You noticed that. The same conversations repeating. The same problem quietly sitting there. The same promises appearing every time you started asking questions again. Look. You remember that pattern, don't you? You would wait. Days would pass. Sometimes weeks. You hoped that patience would give the situation room to move forward. Then eventually you would bring it up again. Carefully. And once again the answer sounded familiar. You're rushing this. You're overthinking. Just give it time. All right. Let's slow this down for a moment. You said something interesting started happening after a while. Each time you heard that answer, you waited a little longer before asking again. You didn't want to seem impatient. You didn't want to push too hard. I understand why that felt like the mature thing to do. But then something else quietly changed while that was happening. Because every time the situation stayed the same, the real question didn't disappear. It just waited with you. You saw that nothing was actually moving. You noticed that the promises always sounded almost identical to the ones before. You noticed it. You knew it, didn't you? But each time that thought appeared, you pushed it aside with the same explanation. Just a little more patience. Just a little more time. Because asking the real question would have forced something uncomfortable into the room. If patience wasn't the answer, then something else had to be. Look, you said something interesting about patience. You kept describing it like it was a virtue. Like you were doing the right thing by not rushing the situation. And I understand why that felt true at the time. Because patience sounds responsible. It sounds mature. It makes you feel like you're giving something the space it deserves instead of reacting too quickly. You probably told yourself that decisions made too fast often end badly. So, waiting felt safer. Waiting felt thoughtful. But when you look back at it now, something about that patience starts looking different. You remember how many times the same situation repeated. The same conversation. The same promise that things would move forward soon. You noticed how familiar those moments started feeling. You remember that, don't you? At first patience meant giving the situation time to change. But after a while, patience started meaning something else. It started meaning that the decision could stay somewhere in the future. Because the moment you actually made a decision, something real would happen. Something would shift. Something might end. Something might begin. And that's the part patience quietly protects. You're telling that every time the situation stayed the same, the thought appeared again. The quiet realization that nothing was actually moving. You noticed it. You knew the situation wasn't really changing. You just kept telling yourself that patience was the reason you stayed. Anne. I understand why that explanation felt better. Because the other possibility is harder to admit. That the waiting wasn't really about patience. It was about postponing the moment where you would have to choose. Because once a decision appears clearly in front of you, things stop feeling comfortable. You can't sit in the middle anymore. And that's the illusion patience sometimes creates. It makes the waiting feel wise. When in reality the waiting is protecting you from the moment you already see coming. All right. Let's slow this down for a moment. You said something started feeling different recently. Not in the situation itself. The situation may look almost exactly the same as it did before. But the way you look at it has changed. Are you saying that the waiting doesn't feel as convincing as it used to? For a long time the explanation sounded reasonable. Patience. Time. Giving things space to grow or improve. Those words made the delay feel responsible, almost noble. You remember telling yourself that, don't you? You probably thought that choosing too quickly would mean you didn't give the situation a fair chance. You wanted to believe that time would quietly fix what felt uncertain. Well, I understand why that felt like the wiser path. But when you step back now, you're noticing something that was hiding in plain sight. Time passed. Weeks passed. Maybe months. And the situation itself stayed almost exactly where it was. And you noticed that. You remember the conversations repeating. The same explanations returning. The same promises appearing again when the question came up. You saw the pattern. And here's the part that's starting to look clearer now. The waiting itself wasn't really changing the situation. The waiting was changing you. Because every time the same moment returned, you had to make the same quiet choice again. Stay where things are. Push the decision a little further into the future. Tell yourself it's still too early to know. You knew something important about that, didn't you? Patience only works when something is actually moving forward. When there are signs of change. When the distance between where you are and where you hope to be is slowly closing. But you're saying the distance didn't move. You just kept standing in the same place. And once you notice that difference, the word patience starts sounding different. Because patience waits for change. Avoidance waits for comfort. And comfort is exactly what delaying the decision gave you. As long as the decision stayed somewhere ahead of you, nothing had to happen yet. Nothing had to shift. Nothing had to be faced. But now you're looking at the situation more honestly. You see where things are. You see how long they've been there. And the question that used to sit quietly in the background has stepped into the center. If waiting isn't helping anything move forward, then what exactly are you waiting for? Look. You said something that matters now. You're not confused about the situation anymore. For a long time the waiting helped you avoid answering a harder question. You could tell yourself that patience was still the right thing to do. That time might still change something. But you're saying that explanation doesn't feel convincing anymore. You remember the moments when you started noticing that. The same conversation returning again. The same promises sounding familiar. The same feeling that nothing had actually moved. Well, you saw it. And once you see something clearly, it becomes very difficult to return to the version of the story that kept you comfortable before. You knew that, didn't you? Because the situation itself may still look the same today as it did yesterday. The people involved may not have changed. The circumstances around you may not have shifted at all. But something else changed. The way you see it. You're saying that the waiting no longer feels like patience. It feels like standing still while pretending something important is still on its way. I do understand why it took time to reach that point. Because making a decision doesn't just move the situation. It moves you. Once a decision is made, things begin to change. Paths separate. Conversations happen. Reality becomes clear in ways that can't be reversed. And that's the moment you were protecting yourself from. But now the decision is no longer hidden behind the word patience. Now it's simply there. You see the situation. You see where it has stayed. You see what hasn't changed. So, the question in front of you is no longer about time. It's about whether you keep standing in the same place. Or whether you step into the decision that has been waiting for you this entire time. If you decide to